Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the regional update. This webinar is part of the Pacific Northwest Forest Collaborative's workshop webinar series hosted by Sustainable Northwest. Just a couple of ground rules before we start today. Please mute your microphone this whole time unless otherwise prompted, as well as keeping your video disabled. Please use the chat box to ask questions. It will be restricted to chat only with host, so your questions will come to me and then I will share with our speakers today. This webinar will also be recorded, so you're welcome to access it at any time after this. Probably by this evening, it will be hosted. It will be publicized on our event webpage. So stay tuned for that. Let's see. Sorry, it is recording. I just thought it turned off for a second. I will begin today with an update from the regional office. We'll move into an update from Washington DNR, Oregon Department of Forestry, and then we'll have Dylan Cruz from Sustainable Northwest join us. I do think, though, that I may need to change up the order. Brenna White, if you are on from the regional office, could you please raise your hand or start your video? Okay, that's what I thought. So Jen Watkins from DNR, I'm going to have you start out today, and then when Brenna joins, we'll jump to the regional office.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, thank you for having me today. And to all of you, please let me just apologize ahead of time if my audio doesn't come through well. I had a little construction going on in the house, so I've stepped out to the car to hopefully join you in a little bit of quiet. And you know, from the Department of Natural Resources, I just kind of wanted to share a little bit of context. For some people, it's surprising why we engage on the issue of forest health, not only on our land base, but really at a statewide scale. And it was some time ago, the legislature, by code and law, determined that the Commissioner of Public Lands, who leads the Department of Natural Resources, she's really responsible for forest health across all lands and being a state authority on that for Washington. And then through successive years of legislation, we have been directed as an agency not only to take forest health and resiliency really to heart on our own land base, but to act as that leadership across the state and thinking about how we work with partners to establish a vision of how we get to a more resilient state on our forests statewide. And so some of you may recall, because you've worked so closely with us, it was just last year that we stood up a division realizing that is a really big workload that determines and needs some dedicated focus. And we stood up our own division just on forest health and resiliency. And so over the last year, you've probably seen a lot of change, a lot of new faces coming into the agency as we kind of define what that means to have our own division focused on forest health and resiliency. And within that, how we engage more effectively and efficiently with collaboratives, and have that engagement not only come from the division that's focused on forest health, but then from the most appropriate parts of our agency that are relevant to each forest collaborative. And whether that be some of our local landowner assistance folks, working with the fire adapted communities as they stand up, or for some of the all lands collaboratives like Tuppish, having our state lands who have a land base within their geography directly engaging as well. So I just wanted to set a little bit of that context of change you've probably seen, and end that by saying just this week, we have new leadership for the Division of Forest Health and Resiliency. As the division was stood up, it was under Julie Sackett, that many of you may have known as our division manager. And just this week, as Julie retired, we have a new leader, Tara Rentz, who joined us from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, who will be leading that division. So in our constant era of change and growing, new faces as well. And then certainly we still sit under the leadership of not only our commissioner, but our state forester, George Geisler. And a few of the updates I just wanted to share today is really under that notion of shared stewardship and having strategic plans guide our collective vision. We are putting the finishing touches on our forest action plan, which is a statewide plan that aims to really roll up all the strategic plans you may have seen coming out of the Department of Natural Resources, as well as our Department of Fish and Wildlife over the years, taking in that 20-year forest health strategic plan, our statewide wildfire strategic plan, as well as the state wildlife action plan. trying to tie those threads together into one statewide vision that not only says, how do we see ourselves getting to a more resilient state and conserve the forests that we have, but what are the tangible actions we can take over the next 5 years, and where are those priority landscapes that we're really going to focus and want to lean in with partners? And so keep an eye out for that. Hopefully most of you in Washington have felt engaged and contributed to it. The point of the plan was to be really collaborative, because a tenet that we came at it with, a really proactive guiding principle, was we cannot do this alone at the scale that we need to. And so we wanted to develop the plan with our partners so that we're implementing it with them. And you'll be seeing that final product coming out soon. And then we'll be holding ourselves accountable to not only writing an implementation plan over the winter so that people can see themselves and we see who is actually on point for some of those actions, but annually have a progress report so we can really be accountable to this vision statewide. And I say that because we've seen a lot of our work in Eastern Washington take a huge focus for forest health and resiliency in recent years, and rightfully so after the large wildfire seasons we saw. But there are issues facing us at a statewide scale, and it's really exciting to start stretching some of the forest health discussion into Western Washington more concertedly. And so you'll see that coming. The other issues I just wanted to share today from DNR that are hard to avoid is the issues of budget and where we sit in the economic realities facing what is happening in the state kind of as we take in the economic impacts of COVID. And right now at the Department of Natural Resources, for the biennium and the fiscal year that we're sitting in, we operate in kind of 2-year cycles of bienniums of when we receive funding from the legislature and plan our budgets. And right now we're just doing a lot of scenario planning to leave ourselves as many options as we can to look at reductions, to look at the realities that are coming at us and the economic impacts to the state. Our agency does not directly report to the governor because we do report under the Commissioner of Public Lands, but we are a state agency that sees the realities that are out there, and we are looking at the budget reduction scenarios we can have. And so as you work with us, you'll begin to see kind of that cautious approach as we define what that looks like, how that relates to forest collaboratives. A lot of the grants we already had underway with our forest collaboratives, as well as the projects forest collaboratives are helping us implement so that we can actually implement our strategic plans. Those are locked in agreements. Those were capital dollars, which are particularly dedicated to a unique focus. And we've signed the contracts and the work is happening. So to date, those funds are safe. But it's just that when you engage with our staff and we start to talk about things such as sponsorships and events, you're just going to see a heightened concern and budget reduction, as well as just our ability to travel and be places. Not only is that partially because of the safety concerns with coronavirus, but we're going to be taking a more conservative approach for a bit. And that's just to maintain our options and make sure we save the funds for our vital organs. And then the looking ahead. We live in these 2-year cycles. And so the biennium that's coming up at us, the 21-23 biennium, the discussions are happening now with our partners to say, how do we approach the legislature to talk about what it looks like and what our financial needs are for forest health and resiliency as we look ahead. And hopefully if you're in a forest collaborative, you've already engaged with our policy staff and our state forester as we're really putting together a package to go into the legislature that says, what if we have an integrated all lands forest health and resiliency package that's twofold? It really looks at a jobs and economic investment strategy by saying, rather than just doing more of the planning, we've got these great plans, we know where we need to act. If we actually start really investing in the implementation of the plans, we can also create a whole lot of jobs on the ground. And so we have an integrated proposal that currently we've just been talking with partners on, including the Washington Forest Collaboratives, our Forest Health Advisory Committee, and other partners, that currently is looking at about $25 million, where we're looking at investments across all lands, federal, state, tribal, private, and local municipalities to say, can we focus some statewide investments and use our programs to actually make a difference on the ground for forest health and at the same time have some economic impacts. And so if you haven't gotten details on that, please reach out to me and I'll make sure that you get a chance to see those details and engage in that discussion as that takes shape. And then we'll be looking ahead that some of the similar budget constraints we think about and the economic realities and scenarios we're running for just today and the reality we're in, those are going to be continuing into the new biennium. We have every expectation that for a bit, we're going to be looking at some tighter times economically. And so while we look at a push related to implementation and jobs and investments. We're also going to be looking at that continued conservative approach about just how we operate as efficiently as possible and do what we can to keep going, but realizing it may be tighter times ahead. And so that's an update here from Washington. And thanks for letting me have a little time with you guys today.
Thank you, Jen. We'll now move into question and answer. We have about 10 minutes for this section. Please type your questions into the chat box and I will make sure that Jen gets to them. As we're waiting for questions to come in, I guess we can start with one, is that how can, or what would your advice be for collaboratives to stay relevant and up to date with DNR, and how can we work with you to support you, and how can you work with us to make sure that we have that relationship continued?
I think, just to be abundantly clear, collaboratives are absolutely critical to our ability to not only meet our mission, but the stated goals of our strategic plans. So hopefully that relationship and intent of the agency to not only participate, but benefit from the discussions of forest health collaboratives is really clear. I think the critical piece that we need to keep seeing is for collaboratives themselves to be vocal with us about if you're getting the engagement you need. From our division, we have a representative who participates or engages with every forest health collaborative. But sometimes the discussions that are occurring in the collaborative require more than just someone from our forest health and resiliency. Sometimes there's actual programmatic staff they need to benefit from, whether that's a collaborative who is facing issues specific to an area of state land. If there's somewhere they want to be able to use the good neighbor authority more effectively on federal lands or have questions about that program, it's letting us know how we can show up to that table and not only participate, but bring the right people to that table. And then the other one is when we talk about these times ahead, helping us not only craft the packages, but forest health collaboratives are sitting on the body of work. They know where the investments can hit the ground best. And so at the department, we can be shaping these packages and proposals, such as the decision package I mentioned for the next session, to be able to make a collective pitch about investments. But working with collaboratives hand in hand to find out where it is that we have the greatest opportunity to take that money to the ground, how we highlight that local success story or the local need, that's really critical. And I think that's something we're going to want to be walking kind of arm in arm with. And then finally, we often say the word that monitoring is important. We talk about adaptive management. But I think making sure we work with our collaboratives to actually start walking that talk, holding ourselves accountable, doing the on-the-ground monitoring, and learning from what is happening on the ground, not only where we get it right, but where we've had challenges and failures or struggles, and being able to tell that story and bring that forward so we can keep getting better. That's a part I'm really excited about in our strategic plans, and I want to make sure we're doing. And no monitoring is going to occur if we aren't doing that collectively. And I think that's a huge role forest collaboratives can help with.
Great, so we have a question from Allison. Are there any discussions or plans to address rangeland health in Eastern Washington as well as forest health?
Allison, there's a really big discussion on that, not only for how it relates to a lot of our wildfire prevention and coordination and planning when we talk about risk assessments. And so not only within forest health and resiliency, but within our wildfire division, recognizing that we have a lot of rangeland that's interspersed in between our forest lands. That comes up quite often. And I'll admit to you, it's identified as a need for us to better understand, but we just haven't invested as much in as forests, that we have a need to be expanding what we talk about forest health. And especially when we look at climate change and some of the shifts we're seeing of some of the grasslands and shrublands expanding into what are currently forests, our need to be discussing that and looking more holistically at the system is critical. So that's a intent I just shared with you and an interest in a discussion, less of where we have really tangible actions laid out. And so it's one I would love to look forward to talking about more. And especially if you have areas you think we need to be focusing or that are of current importance, I'd love to hear more about that if you could reach out.
Our next question is from Anne. In some areas of Washington, she's seen conservation districts as strong leaders in updating community wildfire protection plans. Do you see many representatives from conservation districts involved in your state level planning efforts?
You know, the State Conservation Commission, as well as individual districts, were really important in not only helping develop our forest action plan, but helping us think through the critical opportunities we've got to improve our implementation as we move forward. And so I've seen conservation districts not only play a great role in those community wildfire protection plans, but they play a unique implementation role where they are able to get into a lot of the areas that kind of fall through the cracks of some of our agency programs. One great example is up in Okanagan, where the conservation district is looking at a lot of fuels reduction that's right up against the house and critical implementation to reducing not only wildfire risk, but increasing community resiliency and tied into a lot of those homes that are living right up against the forest. And they're projects that don't fit well into programs DNR has, where we're working with private landowners through landowner assistance and a little bit larger on their property. And so I think conservation districts not only have been critical in our statewide plans so far, but they need to be a critical partner when we talk about implementing these plans, because they play a vital role, not only in the outreach, not only in the planning, but really unique abilities to do some of the creative implementation that falls through the cracks.
All right, our next question, here we go, is how are you moving to the west side, and how will that be different than the east side 20-year health plan on fire-prone forests?
That's a great question. So in our forest action plan, as we began to set landscape resiliency and forest health priorities for the west side, we had to step back and ask ourselves a lot of what are the indicators of forest health on the west side and some of the drivers that actually are influencing whether or not we have healthy forests. When we got over to the west side, there's some issues that are pretty consistent with the east side. The issue of conversion, it may look different, it may have different pressures, but you can't really talk about forest health if we don't have forests. That one really held up as we came over to the west side. The issue of drought was consistent on the west side, but even more apparent that that is just a huge problem as we look at forest health and resiliency over time, and especially underscored as we look at climate change. And then on the west side, there was different issues because fire is important, but we recognized we significantly need to work on increasing our understanding of not only the historic role of fire in west side forests, but the role going forward and how that may change with climate change. And so the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station is doing some great peer-reviewed and working with agencies like ours, scientific studies to help us increase our understanding of fire on the west side. And so there's a real focus early on for us, more on community preparedness on the west side versus on the east side. We not only have that community preparedness need, but we know a lot of the things we can do, the techniques we can do on the landscape to increase that resilience. That's a whole different game on the west side in fire regime. And so right now we have our focus on what we know, which is the community preparedness and the need to better understand the science of whether or not there are different considerations we should have when you go to manage landscapes. And then we looked at a lot of the issues on the west side of just the structure and pattern of forests over there and the hydrology. We heard from many factors that water is a driver. That's common on the east side as well, but on the west side, it plays a different role. And so as we expanded, and you can look at this in our forest action plan, we tried to set up a technical team that helped us get at what those drivers and indicators were of forest health on the west side, some that were similar to the east side, but weighted a little differently. And you'll see that drive where we chose the analysis of where we'll land, where those priority landscapes are. And then they were also influenced just by where the partnerships already exist. And so to some extent, we had a scientific analysis that gave us a little better understanding of what the issues are of forest health on the west side. And then it was met with a little bit of that opportunistic lens of, as we begin to stretch our legs over there, can we go where we already know there is some initiative and momentum with partners to be working so we can get our feet under us. What's going to be different than the 20-year forest health strategic plan in the early years on the west side is we still need to set up the more robust framework. Right now, if you know us on the 20-year forest health strategic plan, when we step into a landscape, we conduct an evaluation. We set a blueprint based on science that defines the need for action spatially and how much action needs to occur to get a more resilient landscape. And that's very focused on terrestrial initially. We don't have that same framework on the west side. And so we set ourselves up to tell us why we would enter an area, why it's prioritized, what are those drivers that are really showing up at a regional scale that make the area pop out. And then we're going to be building with our Forest Health Advisory Council and partners that supporting framework that's more detailed, that gives us a bit more of a roadmap of what we're doing when we're in those landscapes. So stay tuned, and hopefully all the forest collaboratives feel pretty involved in that.
Awesome. And so we have one last question for you. Is DNR engaging directly with tribes in government-to-government relations, or are they supporting government-to-government relations with the Forest Service?
And so for the Department of Natural Resources, we do have government-to-government relations with tribes that occur at an agency level. And then at the same time, in complement, we're working with tribes, not only in collaboratives, but directly on these landscapes that in no way replaces government to government, but allows us to have some of the relations of helping drive and have feedback from them on just a more informal and collaborative level to drive these strategic plans. So our Forest Action Plan is a great example where we had not only on multiple committees driving the development of the plan, tribal representation, but then a lot of input and great feedback in the outreach with tribes to help us select these priority landscapes of where we're landing and helping us define when we overlapped with not only reservation lands, but usual and accustomed territories and ceded territories, what some of those driving factors were that were priorities, what were some of the opportunities of how we could partner better. And so I guess that answer to tribes is we have an obligation for government to government, and that should always occur. We also have an obligation to partner and be creative and step outside of just the government to government to work together in a lot of these areas. And that I've seen a lot of success in.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Are you okay with us sharing your contact information with anyone who follows up afterwards for further questions?
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you. So I'd like to now introduce Brenna White from the Regional Office of the Forest Service. Brenna, are you on the line? Might be on mute. We have some technical difficulties, so she's going to try calling in. Give it 1 minute.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yep, that works.
Excellent. Apologies. We've been having some technical difficulties this evening or this morning so far. It also says that I'm not able to share screen. Would you be able to allow me to share my screen?
Yes, let me do that now. Did that work?
Yep, it sure did.
Great.
Thank you very much. Okay, apologies for that delay, folks. Here. Okay, so I just wanted to provide a few updates of some significant goings on with the Forest Service that may be of interest to this group. And some of these are just, upcoming items where we don't have a lot of information yet, but I wanted to at least take some of this time to share what information we do have and commit to following up with all of you as some of these changes develop. So the first thing that I wanted to touch on today is that the Forest Service is going through a budget modernization process. And this is something that is being done in response to a number of years of congressional interest and direction that did come from Congress and the Office of Management and Budget at the federal level. And fiscal year 21, which begins on October 1st of 2020, so you're just a little bit of more than a month out, is when we're going to have this budget modernization begin to take effect. I wanted to point out a couple of distinction points. One is that the Forest Service as an entire agency is going through this budget modernization process. And then Region 6, the Pacific Northwest region, so all of the national forests and our regional office in Oregon and in Washington, is going a little bit above and beyond in our approach to budget modernization. I just wanted to point out that distinction because if any of you happen to work with any Forest Service units outside of Oregon or Washington, you may experience things related to budget modernization a little bit differently than what you do here in the Pacific Northwest. Essentially, this change is really just aiming to create more transparency in the agency's budget. There's an interest in knowing how our FTE, how our personnel are funded, using what budget line items and what appropriated funds are actually going towards in terms of on-the-ground work. And the hope is that through this modernization process, we'll be able to do that. One of the things that's unique about Region 6 is that we're really going to be focusing most of the fixed costs for our operations at the regional level. So historically, national forest units and their districts would have to cover the expenses of travel and training, the expenses of salary, the expenses of fleet, and other things that are considered fixed costs, and that would come out of their unit budget. All of that is now going to be managed at the regional level. So what that really means is that where we historically have held a lot of discretionary funding at the regional level in times past, that discretionary funding is now going to be shifted to the forest level. That doesn't mean that they're going to receive more funding. That just means that the forests are going to receive more discretion in how they use the funding that they have, because they no longer will have to worry about most of those fixed costs. So I wanted to bring that up to this group because that may, trigger how you may want to think about working with, the forest that your collaborative is involved with. And if you're thinking about working across multiple units, that it may be a little bit of a different approach where you may have held regionally scaled relationships. It may make more sense to have those local level relationships in place. Another thing that may be of interest to this group, and it's very recent, and we're still trying to figure out all of what it's going to look like, but the passing of the Great American Outdoors Act. This is pretty exciting, but it is a really short turnaround for this upcoming fiscal year. So essentially we're in, a very short timeline to produce an implementation strategy for how to actually get work funded and implemented in support of Great American Outdoors Act. And this piece of legislation was proposed by Congress and then signed by the President to establish a 5-year fund for most federal land management agencies to begin to address some deferred maintenance costs. There's a breakdown of what funding is available for roads and trails projects versus what funding is available for other types of infrastructure such as visitor centers, et cetera. And this legislation also permanently funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So for that last point, that's something that we don't have a lot of information on right now. I just wanted to flag that because it is something that we will be able to share more with all of you in the future. But because there is a very tight turnaround for looking at what projects we can fund in fiscal year 21 and what work we can accomplish in fiscal year 21 and rolling that all the way up to Congress within a very short time period, that's where our staff have really been focusing. And if anybody has any follow-up questions on that, I would be happy to address that at the end of this presentation. There is a requirement set by our national office to work in partnership where we can. So this is going to be one of those projects where, particularly for FY22 and the 4 years following that, we'll be looking for community input, we'll be looking for partnership input, and how we can accomplish this deferred maintenance work in a way that does offer some economic support to rural communities particularly, and where there may be some intersectionality with collaboratives. Also wanted to share just a quick update on shared stewardship. This is another one of those areas where there's a lot of footwork that's taking place, but there's not really enough yet that's concrete that we felt that we could give a full presentation on. So we will have more information available on shared stewardship and how that's playing out from the Forest Service perspective later this fall. But the main thing to share here is that we've brought on an all lands program manager to help coordinate our effort in shared stewardship. And we're looking at how we may be able to expand shared stewardship to other federal land management agencies and other state agencies. You know, obviously there's been impacts from COVID-19 and the anticipation of impacts to state budgets, but we're really interested in keeping in good contact with our state and NGO partners to figure out how those realities that we're facing now will impact shared stewardship and what steps we can take to mitigate them in a way that allows us to continue to accomplish good on the ground work. I also wanted to share a quick update on the CFLRP program, or the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. We did have some proposals that were submitted. One was considered a high tier or a tier 1 proposal, and that was for the northern blues. And currently they're being under review by the Secretary of Agriculture, who's the deciding authority on what projects nationwide will actually get approved for CFLR funding. It doesn't sound like there is a lot of funding at the national level for multiple programs to take place for at least this upcoming fiscal year. So we're thinking that there may be only one selected nationwide, but we're waiting to hear on all of those details. And since it's with the Secretary's office, we don't have a definitive timeline on when that decision will be coming out. There will be a media release that will be sure to circulate with partners and collaborative members once there is a decision that's made. And then if folks have any questions, that's just my contact information. You're more than welcome to reach out to me if I don't happen to have the answer myself, which is very, very possible. I'll be more than happy to reach out to the subject matter expert who would have an answer for you and get that to you. And that's all I have, so I'd be happy to address any questions that folks may have.
Thanks, Brenna. We'll move into Q&A for the next 10 minutes or so now. So just as before, please type all your questions into the chat box and I'll make sure that Brenna gets them. So to start, with funds going directly to the national forest level, how did collaboratives and their technical assistance providers engage in funding requests for priorities that they used to get from the regional office?
That's a great question. I would encourage folks to continue to communicate with the regional office if you have contacts there. Those folks are still going to be involved in any of these processes. It just may require a few more steps. For example, we have a partnership with RVCC and SNW, and while the funds may be held at the forest level moving forward, it still likely will be the regional office who's managing that partnership and that relationship. It'll just involve a few more cooks in the kitchen and a few more, behind the scenes button pushes of our budget to make things all come together in the end. I would, however, recommend, since there is going to be this shift, and I just ask folks to keep in mind that we're still operating in theory mode. None of this has actually been implemented yet, so this is going to very much be a learning year for all of us as well. But I think it's going to be important for folks that are partners or members of collaborative groups or whomever to establish those good forest level relationships with members of those forest leadership team members, just so that way they're thinking through how collaborative groups may be able to help them accomplish or think through work that they're approving for this funding that they have discretion over now.
Great. Our next question is, could you please re-explain the part about only one CFLRP project being selected nationally?
Sure, that's all speculative at this point in time. It's just we know that there's limited funding, and based off of historic trends, it's seeming that it is probably unlikely that there will be the availability to fund multiple projects unless something changes. Since it's with the secretary and it is ultimately his discretion on what gets funded, and he has the ability to move funds around more so than we would, say, at the Forest Service level. That's all kind of up in the air, but that's just what we're anticipating. So we're hopeful that a project in Region 6 will get selected, but we just don't have a good pulse on that right now, and are kind of mentally preparing for both a favorable outcome and, well, better luck next time. We'll try again next year.
We have a clarification question. Is that because existing projects are still going?
I actually don't have a good answer for that. I don't really know the background, so I would have to do a little bit of digging and circle back to whomever asked that.
Okay. Our next question is, what are the evaluation criteria for determining Great American Outdoors Act projects?
Yeah, that's actually something that, if it's okay with you, I'd be happy to share out with the group, just some information. Maybe I can send that to you in an email later, and then it can get shared out. But there's, I believe, 7 criteria. Partnership is one of those criteria. But yeah, I'll give everybody just kind of a breakdown of what those criteria are, and then what we know about what percentage is coming to the Forest Service versus the National Park Service, and then what percentage from that can actually be used for roads versus facilities, et cetera.
That would be great. I'd be happy to share with everyone if you could pass that along to me.
Yeah, thanks so much for doing that.
Yeah, of course. Are there regional priorities that are shifting or impacted given the budget modernization?
Our regional priorities really aren't being impacted by budget modernization. And right now our regional priorities largely are in lockstep with our national and departmental priorities. But this is aimed at giving forest supervisors and forest leadership teams more ability to recognize the situation that is unique to the communities that they're serving and the landscapes that they're managing, and being able to take action by having discretion in their budget to address the needs that their community members are and raising for them, and that their land managers are flagging for them as well. So I do think that operationally this will probably shift how some of the work gets done and at what level it gets done, but I don't believe that the priorities are changing.
Thanks. Our next question is, do you have any insight into the elimination of funding for the CFLRP program in fiscal year 21?
I don't have any insight into that right now, no.
Okay. Another question about the Great American Outdoors Act. When do you expect a report to be released?
Or can we clarify what kind of report?
How are the question is how are the areas and projects being prioritized, which I think you'll send out, and implementation plans being written, and when do you expect a report release?
Gotcha.
I would guess
So,
this means, yeah, go ahead.
What I can share is that what we're really prioritizing in this region is capital improvement projects, and that's a list that we have had ready to go that's been co-created between our recreation and engineering staff. And then from there, the projects will be sent up. They're reviewed by a cross-discipline team at our regional office for kind of putting prioritization from the regional perspective. And then that will get sent up to our Washington office, who then will go through another round of vetting based off of what the national criteria is. And then that will get sent up to the department and then to Congress. And what the outcome or the timeline is at that point in time, we're still not completely clear on. But we're hoping to be able to start moving out on actually obligating some of these funds and starting some of this work late fall, early winter timeline. But that's all barring approval at the national level.
Thanks, Brenna. And thank you for participating today. If anyone has any other questions, please let me know and I can connect you with Brenna afterwards. Next up, we'll have Kyle Sullivan with the Oregon Department of Forestry.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm Kyle Sullivan. I am the acting Federal Forest Restoration Program lead. I'm just going to start off with just giving the group a quick brief about the history of the program within the Oregon Department of Forestry. Started back in 2013, 7 years ago, was made permanent by the state legislature in 2017. With the purpose of increasing pay scale and quality of federal forest restoration by leveraging the work of local collaborative groups and participating with the U.S. Forest Service and BLM. About 60% of Oregon's forests are managed by federal agencies. So the program is instrumental in achieving ODF's mission, our agency's mission of serving the people of Oregon by protecting, managing, and promoting stewardship of Oregon's forests. So all that's to say that, the FFR program was created to support our federal partners in managing their forests in Oregon. With that, I was just going to dive right in. I'm going to cover some budget situation updates, some performance and results that from the program's perspective, a G&A update, and then just a quick look forward to our next biennium, the 21-23 biennium. So for the budget situation for our current biennium, the 19-21 biennium, which ends next June, we had a $1 billion state of Oregon revenue shortfall, which essentially translated in various savings. I don't want to get into the details because it'll probably bore you guys, but basically our department has to implement a $4.7 million budget reduction for the remainder of the biennium. That's Oregon Department of Forestry. Our portion, the FFRP, the Federal Forest Restoration Program's portion of that is $359,000 or 11% reduction. So we have to implement that for the remainder of the biennium. The fortunate thing that we have is we have about 25 supplemental project agreements in place with our federal partners to be able to leverage federal funds to complete and fulfill our mission. So we are fortunate in that we can lean a little bit more heavily on those federal funds to complete the same amount of work. Now, the reduction could translate into less fuels mitigation work and timber sale prep work that relies on those state general fund dollars. There's also 82,000 of the 359,000 that's coming from, that's left over from previous biennia from our collaborative grant program administered by OWEB. But yeah, I'd be open later on for any specific budget questions, but the gist of it is, we'll be relatively okay this biennium because of the availability of federal funds. So with that, I wanted to get into just some high-level overview. I'm going to kind of throw a lot of numbers. Hopefully, it makes sense to you all, but I wanted to highlight our technical assistance and science support grant program that provides technical assistance to our collaboratives in our state. We awarded $266,000 of those task grants, we call them, for the current biennium that benefited 8 collaborative groups in Oregon, including a grant to Sustainable Northwest for facilitating the Pacific Northwest Collaborative Workshop webinar series, which we're participating in now. We also awarded $540,000 in collaborative facilitation and zones of agreement grants. That's the program administered by OWEB. There was 11 different grants to 11 different collaboratives in the state, one of which was to establish a new collaborative on the Siuslaw National Forest. So that's a total of $806,000 to collaboratives for facilitation and technical assistance for the current biennium. So pretty sizable investment that the state and through our program has made in our collaboratives in Oregon. Also wanted to touch on our PACE, or Planning Assistance and Categorical Exclusion Grant program for the current biennium. We awarded $630,000 to various projects across the state to the various national forests, including 3 categorical exclusion development projects, LiDAR surveys on 3 forests, sampling efficiency studies, and various surveys in the support of managing our federal lands and increasing pace and scale and quality of forest restoration. And again, I'd be happy to provide a little bit more insight in if there's any specific questions on those grants. With that, I was going to move into a G&A update, and this is very, very brief and high level, but we have roughly 25 supplemental project agreements or forest-specific agreements in place with forests across the state. We have about $8 million under SPA, we call it, for service work, so fuels reduction, anything that enhances the forest's mission and goals that does not involve timber sales. So, and that's up from $4.5 million from this time last year. So significantly more money under agreement from last year. We have about $7.3 million under product removal SPAs or timber sale SPAs, and that's up from $1.8 million last year. And I just remind folks that those are agreements over the next 6 years through 2026. So lots of money, but it's obviously spread out quite a bit, a long time, but sort of gives you a snapshot of the program of work that's been built up between ODF and our federal partners. ODF has offered 20 G&A timber sales to date, treating 7,200 acres and creating 45 million board feet. We've contracted 4 categorical exclusions that result in signed decision memos, and we have 3 in development currently. And then just very briefly, the 21-23 biennium looking forward, we had a potential, we had a $1 billion shortfall for this biennium. There's a potential for a $4 billion shortfall, state budget shortfall for next biennium. So pretty, dire forecast. We're waiting on, I guess, October is when our next economic forecast is going to be provided. So we'll have a little bit better picture then. But we've been asked as ODF to submit both a 10%, which is statutorily mandated every biennium, 10% budget reduction exercise, but also a 25% budget reduction exercise, and showing how that would look. We're kind of speculating at this point. Again, we don't have what the economic forecast, and we don't know exactly where everything's going to shake out, but just sort of, indicating the fact that our agency, Oregon Department of Forestry, and our program specifically may, have to realize a reduction of our budget. So I just wanted to pass that along to you all. And with that, that's all I had for my update.
Thanks, Kyle. We'll now move into question and answer for the next 10 or so minutes. Again, please type your questions into the chat. We'll begin with, what does ODF see for the future of collaborative support grants through OWEB and the task grants directly from ODF?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the real question is, what is this next biennium going to look like? And I think, our state forester, Peter, is, he wants to maintain the relationships that we've built over the past, 7 years with our collaboratives. And it's certainly a priority. I will say that, our staff, our 4 coordinators, they're definitely our highest priority, and for state funds, and keeping them whole and reducing the amount of layoffs is a priority of our agency. So those are, sort of the 2 things, but at this point it's pure speculation. So, but I will just pass along again, the commitment to those collaborative capacity grants and zones of agreement grants through OWEB, and then the task grants are a priority of our leadership, maintaining those.
Thanks. So a similar question that we had with DNR, is ODF engaging directly with the tribes on government-to-government relations, or supporting government-to-government with the Forest Service?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I may not be the best person to ask for that particular question. To be honest, I don't know. In the capacity of our federal forest restoration program, the answer is no, but that I'm not sure to the extent, because we have landowner assistance, and we do work with the tribes in the complete and coordinated fire effort. So to be honest, I don't know, but I could look into that.
Sounds good. What are ODF's priorities for the program of work in light of budget cuts?
Yeah, so again, we're relatively fortunate as far as being able to utilize our federal funds. Now, our priorities are maintaining our people and reducing layoffs, and that's across the department, and also maintaining our commitments through these Good Neighbor Authority supplemental project agreements, and fulfilling our mission. So I guess to put a finer point, basically our seasonal crews that we keep on through state FFRP dollars to accomplish fuels reduction, timber sale layout, and other projects, those could be impacted if those particular projects relied on state funds. Now, if the projects had federal monies through the CFLRP or through a project-specific SPA, then those will continue because they're not impacted by our state budget. So hopefully that provides a little bit more clarity there, but yeah.
Thanks. As of right now, it doesn't look like we have any more questions in the chat box, but I'm going to have Dylan Cruz from Sustainable Northwest give his update. And I think since you both are discussing Oregon, we may have some joint questions afterwards. So thank you, Kyle, for joining us, and welcome, Dylan.
Great. You can hear me all right, Sally?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So thank you to everybody for joining. And I appreciate the, the presentations that we've had from Jen and Kyle and Brenna so far. So I'm just going to dig a little bit deeper on some of the issues that they addressed here, give you a little bit more of a general overview of where we're at with state and federal budget issues and some policy updates right now. And then I've got some clarifying stuff I'd be happy to share on CFLRP with the group here in a moment. So I'm just going to start with the state budgets here in Oregon and Washington, just to talk a little bit about what's been going on with the budget adjustment process and kind of what we're looking at in terms of revenues to kind of follow on what Kyle just presented. So I think many of you know, Oregon had a special session on August 10th that concluded. That was the second one that we had this year. So the budget that the lawmakers ultimately approved for that made approximately $400 million in reductions. It tapped about $440 million in one-time funds and resource adjustments, so vacancies and moving funds around. And then it took $400 million from the Education Stability Fund to protect the education budget, as well as healthcare and other core services as we're going through the remainder of this biennium and trying to respond to the COVID pandemic. So all in all, Oregon was covering a budget deficit of approximately $1.2 billion, and that's how they closed that gap. As far as the impacts of the Oregon Department of Forestry's budget specifically, and this was teed up a little bit by Kyle, there's about $8.2 million in reductions for the department overall, and about $4.8 million of that was general fund. The way that broke down total was about $5.7 million came from the Fire Protection Division, which is the largest amount of ODF's general fund. They took about $1.9 million from private forests, $1.3 million from agency administration, and then $359,000 from the Federal Forest Restoration Program. So those reductions in FFRP were coming from staffing, having foresters related to Good Neighbor Authority, project design and layout. It was task dollars, it was administration, and then it was unused collaborative capacity grants. So there was approximately $82,000 in collaborative capacity grants, which had not yet been allocated in a competitive process. And so those funds were essentially swept. Technically, these are all one-time reductions for the remainder of the biennium, but we're going to be continuing to look at budget difficulties moving forward. And that kind of goes on what Kyle was saying here. We need to see what happens next. During that special session, ODF also actually received some funds. They received about $10.4 million in fire cost recovery from the 2019 fire season that they had not yet been reimbursed for large fire costs. They received some funding to continue their work on wildfire invoicing and financial management support. And there was a bill passed, House Bill 4304, which is going to be doing a study on the costs of wildfire protection and suppression moving forward. So the agency can be thinking about how we're funding wildfire protection and large fire costs in the future, and thinking about that structure in future biennia, as we have seen these skyrocketing large fire costs over the last decade. As we look into the next biennium for 2021 and 2023, state economists are forecasting an approximately $7.8 billion revenue loss through 2025. Okay, so it's about $4 billion of a shortfall in the next biennium and $7.8 billion total over the next two biennium. So ODF is being directed to submit their standard 10% reduction plan. They're working on their agency request budget, which is due at the end of August. They have not been formally requested to do that 25% reduction like Kyle has suggested. Although, as we're looking at these numbers and we're thinking about how we're going to close that budget gap, there have been some suggestions that we could be looking at a reduction scenario as high as 25%, but it's very early to tell where we're going to go. Turning to Washington State now, very different picture over there. They have not gone through the same budget adjustment process as Oregon. There has been some talk of a special session, but they have not gone through the sort of budget review process that we have. In Washington State, the revenue is expected to decrease by $8.8 billion over the next 3 years, so the remainder of this biennium and next. But for context, the state's current 2-year budget is about $53 billion, which is about twice of Oregon, so significantly larger when we think about their situation. They're looking at about $4.5 billion in a shortfall over the rest of their biennial budget. and about 3.5 billion of that can be covered in reserves. So a lot less dire situation than what we have here in Oregon, particularly because of a different tax structure associated with income taxes versus other options. Oregon has really felt that burden because of our dependence on income tax and obviously people's work situation and employment right now. The governor has taken actions to try to cover some of that gap, though. Furloughs for approximately 40,000 general government workers. They did cancel planned pay raises for about 5,600 state employees, and they are looking at potential cuts of as much as 15% as needed to close that remaining $1 billion budget gap. And then finally, looking to Washington, D.C. and the federal level, the House and Senate are on recess right now, coming back soon. You know, the biggest question right now is whether or not there will be another stimulus package and economic COVID relief package. I think most people have seen the House and the Senate are very far apart on this issue right now. House has already passed its package. The Senate is still unable to come to terms on what would be included. Even the Senate Republicans are very divided and very far apart about what they would do there. So it remains to be seen if we're even going to see another one of those. As far as the appropriation cycle, looking to fiscal year 21, we're looking at a continuing resolution until after the November election, probably through the end of the year. No one really wants to touch those spending bills right now. They could do a really massive omnibus continuing resolution and COVID relief package to avoid a government shutdown, because we are going to have to address the government shutdown here. So another kind of crisis to manage for. So we might see some action there, but really everything is focused on November and that election, obviously. Much more is going on right now related to rulemaking and administrative reform, frankly. And there's other folks on this phone that are much well versed in that. NEPA guidance and reform that we're seeing out of CEQ and out of the White House, new BLM rules on NEPA and categorical exclusions, east side screens, you know, all of those things are being looked at right now. So a lot more activity related to administrative review, NEPA streamlining and reform. And then on the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, Brenna did let everyone know kind of where that's at as far as waiting for secretarial approval. Sally, can I share my screen here to just show?
You should be allowed.
Do people see this?
Yep.
Great. So I have a chart here that actually breaks it down for folks, because there was this question about why is there only one CFLRP project that would be funded for next fiscal year. And that is because you see here, there's 13 active 2012 CFLRPs that still need to sunset. And in FY21, they would require over $27 million in funding. And you can see what the new proposals are listed below that. So these were the ones that the FACA committee reviewed: 2 extension proposals, 6 tier 1, 5 tier 2, and then 3 alternates. The total cost of all of those projects, if they were all to be funded in this fiscal year, would be over $70 million. $40 million is where CFLRP has really been sitting for the last 8 years. And so if we assume current service levels and a continuing resolution, that's why you're really only looking at one new project, that Northern Blues project, being funded in the next fiscal year. When we look to FY22 and the following year, those remaining 2012 CFLRP projects officially sunset, which frees up a lot more dollars potentially. And even if we funded all of the projects that had been selected by the FACA, that would only be about 51 million total. So you start to see those new projects coming online, but that's the gap and the delay that we're seeing right now as those FY21 projects or those 2012 projects are finishing their final year. So I'm going to stop there. I know that's a lot. It's recorded. I'm happy to share notes with people and take questions from anybody on what I laid out here today.
Thanks, Dylan. We do have one question or 2 questions, but before I jump into them, I'm wondering, you did touch on Oregon and Washington, so if there's anything that Jen or Kyle wanted to add, you'd be welcome to jump in now. I'll give you a moment, otherwise we can move into questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide one point of clarification, not a huge deal, but the task grants were fully funded and obligated for this biennium, just because they were obligated prior to any budget reduction talks. So just wanted to provide that.
Thanks, Kyle. Jen, would you like to add anything else? Otherwise, I can jump into questions.
Go ahead and move into questions.
Sounds good. So the first question for Dylan is, are there any prospects for recommendations for the Governor's Wildfire Council moving forward in the upcoming legislative session?
So legislative concepts for the next biennium are going to be due here in mid-September coming up. There have been a number of conversations with members about bringing some of that back. Certainly the biggest issue right now is obviously we're looking at a budget reduction scenario, so no new money for any of that. And a lot of what was in the Governor's Wildfire Council report was certainly tied to additional dollars. What we have done with a number of organizations is try to distill out some of those recommendations that are low or no cost. So you could be looking at things related to prescribed fire policy, land use policy associated with community protection, defensible space, building codes. There's things that we can be doing associated with utility mitigation planning. So we have been working with a few members on saying, can we pull some of these out and continue to move forward some policy reform in the absence of dollars, and then create a structure if and when dollars become available. So it remains to be seen, I think, right now what gets moved forward, but know that members are still interested in those, and we're going to try to introduce some bills that pick and choose some of those low cost recommendations. I think we have to keep talking about all of it, particularly with what we're seeing in California. Just because we don't have the money doesn't mean we're not keeping the pressure on about the reforms that need to happen, but we need to go into it with open eyes about realistically what we're going to be able to fund for the next 4 years.
Great, and a clarification question. Are you saying that the Northern Blues will be funded in 2021, and has that been decided?
So the Northern Blues project is the #1 recommended project on the FACA list, and they have rankings, and those rankings are available on the Forest Service website. I'm not sure this group has seen it, so you can see where everything ranked. If the FACA recommendations are approved by Secretary Perdue as drafted, the Northern Blues would be the #1 project, and therefore they can fund one project this fiscal year, and that would be the one that is funded in that order of operations. So we're waiting for that approval, and then we wait to see if we get a continuing resolution or an approps bill, and then they would actually fund the projects in order.
Sounds good. And then passing this question on to you, do you have any insight into the elimination of funding for CFLRP in 2021?
I mean, the White House has zeroed out CFLRP for the last 3 years that it's produced a budget that's, along with other budgets that the White House has produced. Those have always been non-starters. It hasn't gone anywhere. CFLRP continues to enjoy really strong support, and I think it's a bipartisan program. House and Senate have consistently funded it at $40 million for the last 8 years. I don't see any concerns that it would be zeroed out. And again, we're looking at a CR right now that's going to push us through the end of this year anyway. We'll see what the makeup of the House and Senate looks like after the election, but the program has been authorized through 2023, and I would assume that it continues to be funded at a robust level. The biggest question is, how does that Budget Modernization Act effort impact the amount of funding that we get for CFLRP? Because when you have $40 million, keep in mind that a big chunk of that is currently going to agency cost pools, approximately $12 million a year. So if we implement the budget modernization recommendations and we get $40 million again, is that $40 million all go to implementation, or are they going to fund CFLRP at more like a $28 or a $29 million level and then pull costs out for agency operations? We don't yet know how that's going to be handled, particularly with the Senate appropriations staff.
Thanks, Dylan. I don't see any other questions in the chat. We can wait a moment or two if anyone has anything else. Otherwise, anyone who has questions after this or who'd like to follow up. Oh.
Yeah, I'm almost done.
Oh, sure. Hey, Trent, do you want to mute?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I did have a quick question for Dylan. I was trying to type. Dylan, can you
right ahead.
Can you just clarify what you just said? What percentage they were taking out of the 40 million in the past and how that would change? They could potentially be taking more out of the 40 million?
No, not necessarily. So basically what it is the interpretation of CFLRP and whether those dollars should go to implementation and what the definition is of implementation. And that's kind of part of what's driving a lot of this agency budget modernization effort, is to separate out, like Brenna was saying, salary costs and other fixed costs and fleet costs and things like that from dollars hitting the ground. Salary is a part of the CFLRP program and it being administered and the contracting occurring right now. And so there's cost pools that are being pulled, if you will, from CFLRP. If we get the budget modernization effort in place and implementation dollars are separate from those other salary costs, are we basically working with a flat budget level, or are they going to put more of those dollars into implementation and keep like $40 million for funds hitting the ground and then have separate funding for agency operations costs? Or are they just going to take that 40 million and break it up and say, here's your agency operations piece, here's your other implementation costs? So it's basically, I don't know if I'm doing a very good job of explaining it. It's, how much money's hitting the ground ultimately, and it's how they cut up that pie. And if we're going to have more dollars for implementation, or if we're going to be working with the same current service levels. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Dylan. I think I may have shamed Trent into talking out loud again. He says yes.
Okay.
All right, so I don't see any more questions in the box. Again, if you do have questions, please let me know and I can connect you to any of our panelists today. Thank you, Dylan, Kyle, and Jen, and Brenna for joining us. We're going to switch now to thanking our sponsors. So this event wouldn't be possible without our sponsors, Hampton Lumber, Oregon Department of Forestry, the Forest Service, Beneficial State Bank, and Timberline Lodge. We thank you for participating today. If you're interested in learning more or participating in any of our other webinars, we have 4 or 5 coming up through September and October. You can join our email list or reach out to me. My contact information is at the bottom of your screen here. Thank you again for coming today. This webinar was recorded and will be posted so you can access it at any time. Have a great day, everyone.